At 39 years old, I had $47 in my pocket, a 9-year-old boy asleep in the passenger seat, and a key to a cabin that hadn't been opened since 1965. The key was heavier than it should have been. That was the first thing I noticed when the lawyer set it in my palm. Iron, dark with age, shaped like something out of an old photograph. It felt like it had been sitting at the bottom of a drawer for so long it had forgotten what doors were for. The lawyer slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and said, "Miss Ashworth, there are 3 conditions. You can't sell the property. You have to go inside alone the first time, and your son waits in the car." I laughed, not because any of it was funny, because laughing was the only sound I had left that didn't feel like crying. "Who was he?" I asked. "The man who left me this." The lawyer folded his hands. His eyes were the kind that had watched a lot of people sit in that chair and try not to fall apart. "His name was Thaddeus Kessler," he said. "And I believe, Miss Ashworth, he had been waiting for you for a very long time." I didn't know it yet, but that key was about to unlock 60 years of silence, and everything I thought I knew about my own family was about to come undone. $47. That's what I had to my name on the morning my whole life cracked open like an egg. $47 folded in the back pocket of jeans I'd been wearing for 3 days. A 9-year-old boy asleep in the passenger seat of a 2004 sedan that coughed like a man with bad lungs every time I turned the key. And in my hand, a folded piece of paper with an address in Montana that I had never been to, written down for me by a stranger I had only spoken to twice on the phone. That was it. That was the inventory. I sat in that car in the parking lot of a Pilot truck stop somewhere in eastern Wyoming and counted the bills out loud. Twice. Because the first time it came out to $47 and I couldn't believe it, so I counted again, and it was still $47. And then a wind came through the cracked driver's side window that smelled like gasoline and rain, and I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and laughed. Not because anything was funny, because laughing was the only sound I had left in me that didn't feel like crying. My name is Marigold Ashworth. People who love me call me Mari. There aren't many of those left. I was 39 years old that morning. I had been a wife. I had been a daughter. I had been the one who stayed. That was the part I want you to understand first. I was always the one who stayed. I grew up in a river town in Iowa that nobody outside of Iowa has ever heard of. My father worked at a flour mill until his lungs gave out at 56. My mother, her name was Henrietta, but everybody called her Hetty cleaned rooms at a roadside motel until her back gave out 3 years after Daddy died. My older sister, Cordelia, was the pretty one. She got married at 20 and moved to Arizona and stopped returning my calls somewhere around the year my marriage started falling apart. My younger sister, Winifred Wynn, we called her, was the smart one. She got a scholarship to a college in Minnesota and now teaches biology at a high school in Street Paul and sends a Christmas card every year that just says, "Hope you're well." And I was the one in the middle, the one who stayed. I stayed through Cordelia's wedding, which my mother paid for by taking a second mortgage on a house she could barely afford the first one on. I stayed through Wynn's college, which my father funded by selling his pickup truck and walking 3 miles to work every morning for the last 2 years of his life. I stayed through my mother's bad years, the years after the funeral, when she would sit in the kitchen with the lights off and tell me in a voice that had no music left in it that I was the reliable one. That meant I was the one who could wait. So I waited. I waited a long time. Probably too long. By the time I met Garrett Ashworth at a church potluck the summer I turned 29, I had already decided that waiting was a kind of life, that a plain life with a plain man was probably the most a girl like me was going to get. And honestly, I thought that was fine. I thought that was enough. Garrett was handsome, the way men in small towns are handsome, big shoulders, a loud laugh, a way of holding open doors that I mistook for manners and only later figured out was a kind of performance. On our third date, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, in the parking lot of a Dairy Queen. He told me he wanted 4 kids and a house with a wraparound porch. I believed him. I believed him through the 5 years after Jonas was born, when Garrett kept saying next year about the house, next year about the other kids, next year about everything. Then came the layoff. Garrett worked at a feed plant outside of town, and the feed plant closed the spring Jonas turned 6. He couldn't find work. Or he wouldn't. After a while, I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The drinking started small, and then it got bigger. The temper started small, and then it got bigger too. I'm not going to walk you through the worst of it. Not because I'm protecting him. He doesn't deserve protection. I'm not going to walk you through it because the women listening to this story already know what the worst of it looks like. You don't need me to draw you a picture. You've seen it. Maybe in your own kitchen, maybe in your sister's kitchen. You know, the day Garrett left was the day after Jonas's 8th birthday. I had made a sheet cake with chocolate frosting. There were 2 candles left burning on the counter when I came downstairs the next morning and found the note. The note said 5 words. I'm not built for this. He took the joint checking account. He took the good truck. He took the title to the trailer we were renting to own, which I didn't even know he had until I tried to find it 3 weeks later. And he left me with a 2004 sedan with a heater that only worked if you hit the dashboard above the glove compartment in a very specific spot. A 9-year-old boy who didn't fully understand yet that his father was not coming back, and a name on a checking account that had $38 in it. That was 11 months before the morning in the Pilot truck stop. 11 months. I want to tell you what 11 months of running out of places to land looks like, but I can't really. Not all at once. It comes back to me in pieces. I remember the first shelter in Topeka, the one that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee. I remember the social worker there, a tired woman with kind eyes named Bernadine, who pressed a card into my hand and said, "You call this number, baby, if you need to come back." I didn't call. I should have called. I remember the second shelter in Lincoln, the one where Jonas slept with his stuffed rabbit pressed to his chest because there were too many strangers in the room, and he couldn't make his eyes stop watching the door. I remember the church basement in Salina, Kansas, where a woman named Marlene gave Jonas a juice box and did not ask me a single question. I think about Marlene a lot. I hope she's well. I hope somebody is giving her juice boxes now. I remember pulling into the parking lot of a 2-4-hour grocery store in Denver in late October. The 10th shelter I'd called that week had been full. So had the 9th. So had the 8th. I sat in that sedan with Jonas asleep beside me, and I counted my money 3 times, and it kept coming out to $23.17. That was the night I stopped believing things were going to turn around. That was the night I started believing in the dark. That was the night, exactly 6 days later, that my phone rang from a Montana area code I had never seen before. I almost didn't answer. I was sitting in the sedan in another parking lot, this one outside a Walmart in Cheyenne. Jonas was inside using the bathroom. I had the heat going as long as the engine ran, which wasn't long because gas was $3.50 a gallon and the tank was a quarter full. The phone buzzed. Unknown caller. Area code 406. I let it ring 3 times. Almost let it go to voicemail. Then something I still don't know what made me pick it up. Hello? Is this Margaret Ashworth? The voice on the other end was old, calm, the kind of voice that has spent a long time choosing its words carefully. It's Marigold, I said. But yes, that's me. Miss Ashworth, my name is Lawrence Pemberton. I'm an attorney up in Cedar Junction, Montana. I'm calling about an estate matter. I almost laughed. Estate matter, as if I had any business with an estate of any kind. My estate at that moment was $47 and a child in a car that needed an oil change 6,000 miles ago. I think you have the wrong person, I said. I don't know anybody in Montana. There was a pause. on the other end. A long one. The kind of pause that lawyers make when they've been waiting a long time to say something and they're deciding how to say it gently. Miss Ashworth, he said, a man named Thaddeus Kessler passed away approximately 11 months ago. He left a piece of property to you. The cabin and the surrounding acreage at a place called Kessler's Hollow in Lewis and Clark County, Montana. I held the phone away from my ear and looked at it. Then I put it back. I don't know anybody named Thaddeus Kessler. The pause again, longer this time. I think the lawyer said that he knew you, Miss Ashworth. I drove 1,400 miles to Montana on the strength of that one sentence. I think he knew you, Miss Ashworth. I want you to understand something. I did not believe him. Not really. I drove because I had nowhere else to drive. I drove because the women's shelter in Cheyenne had a 6-week waiting list, and because the temperature was supposed to drop into the teens by Friday, and because the alternative to driving was sitting in a Walmart parking lot waiting for a miracle that I had stopped believing in 2 weeks earlier. But underneath that, underneath the practical math of a desperate woman, there was something else. Because nobody had said, I think he knew you to me in a very long time. Nobody had said somebody was thinking about you in any version of those words. For 11 months, the world had been very clear about the fact that I was a woman nobody was thinking about. Not Garrett, not Cordelia, not Wynn, not the agencies whose phones I called and whose voicemails I filled and whose forms I filled out twice. I was a ghost passing through other people's parking lots. And then a voice from Montana said, I think he knew you. So I drove. Jonas didn't ask many questions. He had learned somewhere around month 4 that asking questions about where we were going was a way of making me cry. And Jonas hated to make me cry. He was the kind of 9-year-old who chewed his bottom lip when something worried him. He had gotten that habit from his father, and it was the only thing of Garrett's that I actually wanted my son to keep, because a boy who thinks before he speaks is a boy who will always find his way home. He pressed his face against the window and watched the land flatten out and then start to climb. Wyoming gave way to Montana somewhere around dusk on the second day. The mountains began as a smudge on the horizon. Then they became a wall. Mama, Jonas said, why does the sky look bigger here? I didn't have an answer. I had become very good at not having answers. We slept in the car that night at a rest stop outside of Billings, Jonas under his coat, me with the seat tilted back as far as it went, and the keys in the ignition just in case I had to leave fast. I had become very good at sleeping with one ear listening for footsteps. We pulled into Cedar Junction, Montana at 2:47 inches the afternoon on the 7th of November. It was a town the size of 3 blocks, a diner, a post office, a hardware store, a church with white siding that needed paint, a second-floor law office above what used to be a bank and was now a real estate agency. The sign on the door said Lawrence Pemberton, attorney at law. I left Jonas in the car with the engine off and a window cracked and the key in my pocket. He had a paperback book about dragons that the woman at the church basement in Salina had given him, and he was on chapter 12, and he promised he wouldn't move. The stairs up to the second floor smelled like old wood and pipe tobacco. The lawyer stood up when I walked in. He was older than I'd expected, 70s maybe, wire glasses, white hair combed back, the kind of face that had spent a long career sitting across from people on the worst days of their lives. Miss Ashworth, he said, please, sit down. I sat. He didn't waste any time. He pulled a folder out of a drawer and he set it on the desk between us, and he opened it. The estate of Thaddeus Kessler, he said, is a relatively simple one. There is a primary dwelling, a cabin, and approximately 231 acres of land surrounding it. The land sits in a fold of the foothills locally known as Kessler's Hollow. It is yours, Miss Ashworth, free and clear, subject to 3 conditions. He paused. Conditions? I said. 3 of them, he said. They are not unusual conditions exactly, but they are very specific, and Mr. Kessler was very clear that they were not optional. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me. I looked at it. 3 lines. 1. The property may not be sold. 2. You must cross the threshold of the dwelling for the first time alone. 3. Any minor child in your care must remain in the vehicle until you have done so. I read it twice. My son is 9 years old, I said. I know, the lawyer said. He's in the car right now. I know. Who makes a condition like this? A man, Lawrence Pemberton said, who has been dead for over a year, and who was in life the most careful man I ever represented. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Who was he? The lawyer folded his hands on the desk. His eyes did something, then they softened in a way that felt practiced, like he had been waiting for me to ask that question since the moment I walked through the door. His name was Thaddeus Kessler, he said, and I believe, Miss Ashworth, with every part of my professional judgment, that he had been waiting for you for a very long time. Then he reached into the folder one more time, and he took out a key. He slid it across the desk. The key was iron, dark with age, heavier than a key has any right to be. I picked it up, and the world tilted, just a little, the way it tilts when you walk into a room you've never been in and feel somehow that you've been there before. The road to Kessler's Hollow was a back road off a back road off a back road. The GPS lost the signal about 6 miles in, then it lost the road itself. Then it gave up and showed a blue dot floating in the middle of an empty gray grid, and I switched it off because watching the dot float in nothing was making me feel like I was floating in nothing. The pines grew up tall on either side of the gravel and closed over the top in places like the roof of a cathedral. The light underneath them was green and old and quiet. Jonas pressed his hands against the window glass and didn't say anything for a long time. Mama, he said finally, are there bears up here? Probably. Are we going to see one? Maybe. Are we going to live here? I didn't answer, because I didn't know, because the only thing I knew was that a lawyer in a town the size of 3 blocks had handed me an iron key and a piece of paper, and somewhere up this mountain there was a cabin that had been waiting. The gravel got steeper. The sedan complained. The engine made a sound it had never made before, and I gripped the steering wheel hard, and I prayed in the way that women who have stopped believing in God still pray, which is to say I didn't pray to anyone. I just sent the thought out into the trees and hoped somebody was listening. The pines opened up, and there it was, a wooden cabin, set back maybe 40 yards from the road, standing in a clearing of long brown grass that had grown up and laid down and grown up and laid down for 60 uninterrupted years. The roof sagged in the middle the way an old horse's back sags. One of the front windows was boarded over from the inside. The porch was missing a step. The front door was a slab of weather-darkened wood, the color of old coffee grounds, and above it, carved into the lintel in letters so faded they were almost worn smooth, were 2 words. I couldn't read them from the car, but I could see them. I pulled the sedan up onto the shoulder of the gravel road and I killed the engine, and the silence that came down was enormous. It was the kind of silence that has weight. You could feel it pressing against the windows of the car. Yuna Satup? Is that it? That's it. It looks like nobody lives there. Nobody does. Did somebody used to... I looked at the cabin. A long time ago, I said. Yes. I turned in my seat so I was facing him. His cheeks were red from the cold air leaking in through the dashboard vents. His coat sleeves were too short again. I could see his wrists. Baby, I said, I need you to stay right here for a little bit, okay? His eyes went wide. By myself? I'll be right there. You can see me the whole time. The cabin's right there. Why can't I come? Because the man who left us this place said I had to go inside by myself the first time. That's a weird rule. I know it is. Who makes a rule like that? I almost said a stranger. I almost said I don't know. But I thought about the lawyer's face, the softness in it, the way he'd said he had been waiting for you for a very long time. A man, I said, who I think loved us very much, even though I don't know him. Jonas thought about that. He chewed his bottom lip. Okay, he said finally, but you leave the car door open and the cabin door, so I can see you're still in there. I will. Promise. I promise. I stepped out of the car. The mountain air hit me like cold water. It smelled like pine sap and wet stone and something else underneath something mineral, the way a basement smells when it hasn't been opened in a long time. Except this was outside, under open sky. I walked across the long brown grass with the key in my fist and the wind moving the tops of the pines like a hand running through hair. The closer I got to the cabin, the smaller I felt. There's a difference between a house that has been abandoned and a house that has been shut. Abandoned houses let the weather in. They sag and rot and forget themselves. Shut houses don't. Shut houses hold their breath. This cabin had been holding its breath for 60 years. I climbed the porch. The wood gave a little under my weight, but it held. The front door, up close, was worse than I'd thought from the road. The grain was cross-hatched with weather scars. The handle was pitted iron. The hinges were the color of old blood. And above the door, in letters carved deep enough that even 60 years of mountain wind hadn't worn them all the way smooth, were the words I had seen from the car. Hold fast. I stood on that porch and I looked at those two words for a long time. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know if they were an instruction or a prayer or a warning. I slid the key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. Of course it wouldn't. I had driven 1,400 miles for a key that didn't fit. I leaned my shoulder against the wood. I worked the key back and forth. I felt it catch on something inside the mechanism, and for one terrible second I thought it was going to snap off in the lock, and I thought, good. Good. Of course. Let it break. Let the whole thing be over. And then it gave. It didn't click. It groaned, deep in the wood, like the door itself was waking up. The door swung inward, maybe half an inch, and then stopped, as if it had forgotten how to open the rest of the way. I pushed. The air that came out hit me in the face. It was cold. Not cool. Cold. The way a sealed jar is cold when you open it. The way the inside of a cave is cold, even in summer. And it smelled, I will never forget this, it smelled like somebody else's life. Like the inside of a coat that has hung in a closet for 60 years. Like wool and pipe smoke and something sweet underneath that might have been old apple wood or might have been the ghost of a fire that went out in 1965. Dust hung in the shaft of afternoon light that followed me in. I stepped over the threshold, and the cabin let me see it all at once, the way you see things in a photograph, without time to sort them. A wooden table in the middle of the room, set for two, plates still on it, forks beside the plates, a coffee cup turned upside down on a saucer, a coat on a hook by the door, a pair of men's boots underneath the coat. Sized for somebody bigger than me, a rocking chair angled toward the stone fireplace the way you angle a chair when you have just stood up from it, a kettle on the wood stove in the corner. It wasn't abandoned. It was interrupted. 60 years ago, somebody had been living here, and then one day, without warning, without packing, without taking the coat off the hook or the boots from beside the door, they had stopped. I stood in the middle of that room, and I listened to my own breathing. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of Jonas fiddling with the radio in the sedan. Inside, the silence had a shape to it. and then I saw the envelope. It was on the table, beside one of the two plates, set squarely, carefully, the way you set something down when you mean for somebody to find it. It wasn't yellowed. It wasn't dusty. It was a plain white envelope, the kind you buy in a packet of 50 at any drugstore in America. Across the front of it, written in a careful hand, the kind of handwriting that men of a certain generation learned in grade school and never lost, was one word: Marigold. That's my name. That's the name on my birth certificate, the name I had not told a single living person in Montana. Not the lawyer, not the gas station attendants, not the woman at the rest stop outside Billings who had given Jonas a piece of taffy out of pity, but somebody had set this envelope down on this table recently enough that it was still clean. I sat down in the nearest chair because my knees did not feel like holding me up anymore. I sat there for a long time, looking at the envelope, and outside, through the open door, I could hear my son singing along to the radio, some song he had learned at his school in Iowa, the one we'd left behind 9 months ago. His voice cracked on the high notes the way 9-year-old boys' voices crack. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I reached out and I picked up the envelope. The seal lifted under my thumb, without any effort at all. The paper inside was thicker than I expected. Good paper. The kind of paper people used to use when they meant what they were writing down. It was a letter, and the handwriting was the same hand that had written my name on the outside. Marigold. If you are reading this, then the lock has finally turned, and the door that has been shut for 60 years has finally opened, and I owe you more than a letter can hold. But a letter is where it has to start. My name is Thaddeus Kessler. I was, by the time you read this, an old man who lived quietly on the side of a mountain for most of his life. I closed the doors of this house in October of 1965. I did not open them again. I lived the rest of my years in a smaller cabin further down the ridge where I could see the road and where I could wait for somebody to come up it. I shut this cabin because something happened here that I could not set right, and I decided that the house had earned the right to keep its own silence until somebody arrived who could carry what was inside it. That somebody is you. You will not know me. There is no reason you should. But I knew your grandmother, and I knew your grandfather. And before this letter is finished, you will know them both better than your mother ever let you. I stopped reading. I put the letter down on the table. I pressed both hands against my face. Because here is the thing. My mother, Hetty Burroughs, before she married my father, had never, in my entire life, spoken about her parents. Not once. I had grown up believing they were dead before I was born. I had grown up believing that the silence around them was a grief so deep that she could not speak through it. When I was 12 years old, I had sat at the kitchen table in our house in Iowa and asked her carefully, in the gentlest voice I had, whether I had grandparents I had never met. My mother had stood up. She had walked out of the room without saying a single word. And my father, who was sitting across from me peeling an apple with a paring knife, had set the apple down and looked at me with very tired eyes and said, "Don't ask your mother that again, sweet pea." Okay. I had not asked her again, not in 27 years. I picked the letter back up. Your grandmother's name, it said, was Rosalind Kessler. She was my sister. She was the bravest person I ever knew, and the most stubborn and the kindest, and she paid for her choices in ways that no woman in a fair world would ever pay. She married a man named Owen Burroughs in the spring of 1961. I did not approve of the marriage. That is a regret I have carried for 60 years. Owen Burroughs was not a good man. He fooled most people in this valley. He did not fool me. They had one daughter. Her name when she was born was Henrietta Burroughs. I stared at that name. I read it 3 times. Henrietta Burroughs. That was my mother's maiden name. Burroughs. That was the name she had buried so deep under Hetty and under her married name that I had grown up believing Burroughs was a word from a poem somebody had written about somebody else. I did not finish the letter sitting at that table. I folded it very carefully and I put it back in the envelope. And I stood up and I walked to the door of the cabin. I stepped out onto the porch and into the cold mountain afternoon, and I crossed the long brown grass to the sedan where my son was sitting with the radio turned low. He looked up when I opened the driver's side door. "Mama, are you crying?" I touched my own face. My fingers came back wet. I hadn't even known. "A little bit, baby." "Why?" I looked at him, at my son, with his too short coat sleeves and his bottom lip that he chewed when he was worried and his eyes that I now realized for the first time, sitting in that gravel pull-off in the Montana foothills, were not Garrett's eyes at all. They were my mother's eyes. They were Henrietta Burroughs's eyes. They were Rosalind Kessler's eyes, probably, all the way back. "Jonas, I think we just found something good. What did you find?" I couldn't say it yet. I knelt down on the gravel beside the open car door so I was at his eye level. I took his small, cold hand in both of mine. "I'll tell you in a little while. Right now, I need you to come inside the cabin with me. Bring your coat and bring your book. Are we going to live there?" I looked at the cabin over my shoulder. I looked at the sagging roof and the boarded window and the porch with the missing step and the lintel above the door with the 2 words carved into it, "Hold fast." I turned back to my son. "I don't know yet, baby, but I think we just got somewhere." He climbed out of the car. He took my hand, and the 2 of us walked across the long brown grass toward the open door of a cabin that had been waiting for us since before either of us was born. We did not go down the hallway that first day, because I wasn't ready, because Thaddeus Kessler had waited 60 years. The hallway could wait another night. So instead, Jonas and I swept. We opened the windows, the ones that opened. 3 of them did. 2 of them didn't and probably wouldn't ever again. We found a broom in the kitchen closet that still worked. We discovered the hand pump at the kitchen sink still drew water, if you worked the handle long enough, though the water came up the color of weak tea for the first 10 minutes. And Jonas watched it run brown into the basin with his mouth hanging open like he was watching magic. "Mama, is that water?" "That's water, baby. It's the color of root beer. It'll clear up." We found a wood stove in the kitchen that was in better shape than the engine of the sedan. We found a stack of seasoned pine by the back door split by hands that had been in the ground a long time. We found a tin of loose tea in the pantry, real tea, dried out but still fragrant, the smell of it rolling up out of the tin like something I half remembered from a childhood I had not lived. Jonas held the tin under his nose. "Mama, can we drink 60-year-old tea?" "I don't know. Maybe. It smells like Christmas." He was right. It did. I boiled the pump water twice, and we drank 60-year-old tea out of 2 heavy ceramic mugs that we found in the cupboard, sitting at a table with 2 plates on it that we had agreed without ever saying so we were not going to move yet. Outside, the light went bronze, then blue, then gone. I lit the kerosene lantern Lawrence Pemberton had left for me in a wooden crate on the porch. The flame caught. The cabin glowed. Jonas fell asleep in the rocking chair with his stuffed rabbit pressed against his chest, the way he had slept since he was 3 years old. The rocking chair angled toward the fireplace. The same rocking chair somebody had stood up out of in October of 1965. It was a stranger's chair when we walked in. By the time Jonas fell asleep in it, it was his. That was how the cabin started to belong to us, piece by piece. Without anybody asking, I sat up a long time after Jonas was asleep. I watched his chest rise and fall in the lantern light. I said her name out loud once, quietly, just to see how it sat in the room. Rosalind. The cabin didn't answer, but it didn't feel empty either. It felt the way a church feels 10 minutes after the last person has left. I went down the hallway the next morning. Jonas was still asleep in the rocking chair. I moved as quietly as I could. The boards under my feet complained in a way that felt almost like conversation, like the house was saying, "All right then, if you insist." There were 3 doors, one on the left, one on the right, one at the end. I opened the one on the left first. It gave with a small wooden sigh, the way an old book sighs when you open it for the first time in years. And I stepped into a child's bedroom, a single bed, iron frame, made up neatly with a quilt that had faded in stripes, where the sunlight from the small window had crossed it for 60 years. The quilt had a pattern of small embroidered flowers around the border, forget-me-nots. On the bedside table, a low wooden shelf with 3 books. The Velveteen Rabbit, A Child's Garden of Verses. A book of nursery rhymes with no jacket, just the words Humpty Dumpty across the cover in faded gilt letters. The pages of all 3 were worn in the way books get worn when a small person has been read the same pages many nights in a row. There was a rag doll on the pillow. She had button eyes. One of them was missing. The empty thread loop where it used to be was tied off carefully, the way a mother ties off a thread when she means to come back and fix it later but never does. My mother had slept in this bed. I sat down on the edge of the small bed. The springs gave under my weight. They had not given under any weight in 60 years. And I started to cry. Not the kind of crying you do when something is sad, the kind of crying you do when something you didn't know was missing all your life is suddenly placed in your hands. I cried for the woman who had read those books to my mother. I cried for the mother I had buried 2 years ago in a small cemetery in Iowa. I cried because Hetty Burroughs had been 3 years old once, and someone had loved her enough to embroider forget-me-nots around the border of a quilt for her. And then one day in October, that same someone had carried her down a mountain and into a silence that lasted the rest of her life. When I came out, I closed the door very gently, the way you close the door of a room where a baby is sleeping. I opened the door on the right. This room was bigger, a double bed, iron frame, like the small one but heavier. The bed was made, smoothed, tucked, the kind of made-up bed that says, "I will be back tonight." A pair of women's shoes sat under the edge of the bed, flat-heeled, practical, the leather worn at the toes where her feet had pressed hardest when she stood up from a chair. On the dresser, a hairbrush. I picked it up. Dark hair was still caught in the bristles, a strand or two, long. I turned my face away. I put the brush back down exactly where I had picked it up. On the bedside table was a small photograph in a wooden frame. I sat on the edge of the bed and lifted the frame and held it under the light from the window. 3 people on the porch of this cabin. A woman with dark hair pulled back, probably my age, maybe a little younger. She had a baby on her hip. The baby was laughing at something past the camera head thrown back, one little fist held out, mouth open in a wide, delighted O. The woman was not laughing. The woman was looking past the camera too, at whatever the baby was laughing at. But her face had a kind of stillness in it, a held breath kind of stillness, as if she was waiting to see what was going to happen next, and what was going to happen next was not going to be good. Behind her, 2 steps back, stood a man. He was not touching her. He was not touching the baby. He was tall, lean. His hair was dark. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his arms were crossed over his chest, the way a man crosses his arms when he is making sure nobody mistakes him for somebody who is going to lift anything heavy on your behalf. He was not smiling, and there was something in his eyes that I had seen before in another face, across a kitchen table, in Iowa. On a night when I was 8 months pregnant with Jonas, and my husband had been drinking since 1 in the afternoon, I knew that, look, Every woman who has ever lived inside that look knows it. I set the photograph down. I stood up because my mother had spent her whole life softening everything in herself that the man in that photograph had kept hard, making quiet everything he had let run loud, bowing her shoulders to make room for the men she lived with the way a woman bows her shoulders when she has been taught very young to take up less space. I had thought for 39 years that my mother's flatness was just her. It wasn't, it was somebody else's. It was his. She had been wearing it the way you wear somebody else's coat when nobody ever gave you one of your own. I left that bedroom. I closed that door too. I walked to the end of the hall. The third door. The master bedroom. An iron bed frame. A chest of drawers. A wardrobe with one door hanging slightly open. A braided rug on the floor, woven in faded reds and browns. I knelt on the rug. I rolled it back, away from the center of the room. The floorboards underneath looked like any other floorboards at first, but as I ran my hand across them palm flat, slow I felt it. A SAM, a square, cut cleanly into the floor, fitted back in so precisely that if you didn't know to look for it, you would never see it. I found the lifting edge with my thumbnail. It came up in my hand without resistance, as if it had been waiting to come up. Underneath was a shallow space, no deeper than a shoebox. And inside the space was a tin box, the kind of tin that tea or biscuits used to come in, painted blue once, now scuffed almost white at the corners. I lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. I sat down on the braided rug with the tin box in my lap. The tin held 5 things: a bundle of letters tied with brown string, a small black notebook, the kind a man carries in his shirt pocket, a folded official document with a county seal pressed into the outside, a small cloth pouch, drawstring, cream-colored canvas, gone yellow with age, and placed on top of everything else, a black and white photograph I had not seen before. 2 people in it. A woman in a coat, a man beside her with his arm around her shoulders, both of them young, both of them laughing. The woman in the coat was Rosalind. The man with his arm around her was not Owen Burroughs. It was Thaddeus. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, somebody had written, Roz and Thad, October 1959, the summer before she met him. Before she met him, I held that photograph for a long time, because what I was looking at was a woman who did not yet know what was coming, a brother who did not yet know that he was about to lose his sister. I set the photograph aside. I loosened the drawstring on the cloth pouch. 2 things slid into my palm. A wedding ring, plain gold band, small, a woman's size, and a child's silver bracelet. The bracelet had a small charm hanging off it, a bird, a swallow, and on the inside of the band, engraved in tiny letters, was a name, Henrietta. My mother, who had hated jewelry her entire life, who had not worn so much as a watch in any photograph I had of her. I understood now. I understood, sitting on that braided rug with my mother's name engraved in my hand, why she had not worn jewelry. Because jewelry was something her father had bought her. And her father had been the man in the photograph. I picked up the notebook. The handwriting inside was Thaddeus's, the same careful schoolroom hand that had written my name on an envelope and waited 60 years for me to walk in and read it. The first entry was dated April 14th, 1962. Roz came down today with the baby. Owen was not with her. She would not say why. She stayed 3 hours and then walked back up the road to him. The baby is sturdy. She looks at everything the way Roz looked at everything when she was small. I gave her a piece of maple sugar. She laughed. The entries were short, a paragraph, sometimes two. They skipped weeks, sometimes months. But a pattern was emerging. June 1962. Roz came with a bruise on her forearm. She said it was from a kitchen accident. I did not press her. I should have pressed her. November 1962. The baby was sick. Roz walked her up the ridge in a storm because the truck would not start and Owen was away. I kept them 2 nights. Owen came for them on the 3rd morning. He was angry. He did not speak to me. He did not look at the child. March 1963. I tried to speak to Roz outside the church. She would not look at me. She said, "Thad, you do not understand what it is to have chosen." I said I did. I do not understand now. August 1964. The baby is 2. She called me uncle today for the first time. Roz corrected her, said she is not to use that word. February 1965. Roz came alone. She asked me, "If anything ever happens to me, would you keep her?" I said yes. She left. I did not see her again until October. I knew what was coming, because every woman who has ever read a chronicle of another woman's marriage to a man like Owen Burroughs knows how it ends. I turned the page. The next entry was dated October 9th, 1965. The handwriting was different, not the careful schoolroom hand. The same hand, but faster, less even, as if the man writing it had been holding the pen too tight. Owen came to this cabin today at 3 in the afternoon. He was drunk. He said Roz had taken Hetty and run. He said he knew I was hiding them. I said I was not. He did not believe me. He had a pistol. He pointed it at me. I took it from him. In the taking, it discharged. He died on the floor of my front room before I could stand up from where I had been knocked. I sat with him for an hour. I did not know what to do. Then I went down the ridge to find Roz. She was at the boarding house in town with the child. I told her what had happened. I told her I would go to the sheriff in the morning. She said no. She said if I went to the sheriff, they would take Hetty from her because she was the wife of a dead man and the sister of the man who had killed him. She said the county would never let a woman like her keep a child like that. She said it was 1,965 inches a town like this, and they would put her in a hospital and put Hetty in a home, and that was if they were being kind. She said, "I will not lose my daughter over Owen Burroughs. He took every other thing I had while he was alive. He does not get to take her too while he is dead." She told me what to do. I did it. I buried him on the far side of the ridge, where the creek bends around the granite, under the cedar that has been there longer than this cabin has. I drove his truck into the lake at the old quarry. I came back. I burned the floorboards where he fell. I laid new boards. I scrubbed everything I could not burn. I cleaned this cabin, and I closed it, and I did not open it again. The county wrote it down. 2 months later, they wrote that Owen Burroughs had abandoned his wife and child and left the state. Nobody looked for him. Nobody in this valley wanted him found. Roz took Hetty and left. She would not let me come with her. She would not let me write. She said, "Thad, you did this for me, but I cannot look at you now. I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry." She was gone 2 weeks later. I have lived 60 years on the far side of this ridge, with Owen Burroughs on the other side, and with my sister's face on the other side of a door she would not open, and with a niece I could not name, and with a great niece I have watched from a great distance. This book is for Marigold, who will be the only person I ever tell. I closed the notebook. I set it down on the rug very carefully. My grandmother, My grandmother had stood in a boarding house in a Montana town in October of 1965 with her 3-year-old daughter on her hip and her husband's blood on her brother's floor, and she had made a choice. The choice had cost her her brother. The choice had cost my mother a family. The choice had cost me 60 years later every single thing I had thought I understood about where I came from. And it had saved all three of us. Because I could see it now. I could see what would have happened in 1,965 inches of county like that. A woman whose husband was found dead in her brother's cabin would have been looked at sideways for the rest of her life. A child raised inside that sideways look would have grown up believing she was the reason her father was dead. Rosalind had chosen to carry it herself. She had chosen to carry it out of that valley and into a life so silent that her own granddaughter had believed for 39 years that there was nothing to know. I understood my mother then. I understood her for the first time. The flatness, the silences, the way she had sat in the dark kitchen after my father died and told me in a voice with no music in it that I was the one she could rely on. She had been raised by a woman carrying a body she could not put down. And she had learned from watching that love was something you carried alone, because bringing anyone else into it would crush them. Jonas found me there. I didn't hear him come down the hall. He just appeared in the doorway, rubbing one eye with the back of his hand. His hair was sticking up on one side from the rocking chair. "Mama, why are you sitting on the floor?" I opened my arms. He came across the room and sat in them the way he used to sit in them when he was 4 years old. "I found something," I said into his hair. "Something good?" I thought about how to answer. "Something true," I said. He was quiet for a long time. "Is true better than good?" "Sometimes, baby. When you've been lied to your whole life and you didn't know." He thought about that. "Were you lied to?" "Not on purpose." "Then why didn't you know?" "Because the person who was hiding it loved me very much." He was quiet again. I felt his small heart beating against my collarbone. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" I held him tighter. "Yes, baby." "How do you know?" I looked over his shoulder at the open tin box, at the letters, at the notebook, at the small cloth pouch, and my mother's bracelet, and the ring my grandmother had worn for the 4 worst years of her life. "Because somebody who loved us before we were born," I said, "made sure we would be." 2 days later, I drove into Cedar Junction, and I climbed the stairs to Lawrence Pemberton's office for the second time. He looked up when I walked in. He didn't seem surprised to see me. I set 3 things on his desk: the notebook, the folded document with the county seal, the bundle of letters, in that order. "I've questions. I expected you would. Did you know?" He folded his hands. He chose his words the way a man chooses his footing on a wet rock. "I knew some of it. I did not know all of it. Thaddeus was my client for 31 years. He told me what I needed to know to execute his estate. And not one word more." "Did you know about my grandmother?" "I knew he had a sister. I did not know her name until I opened his instructions the morning after he died." "Did you know about my grandfather?" "No." "A man who has spent 31 years being told exactly what he needs to know and no more does not develop the face of a liar." "The land, is it really mine?" "It is really yours." "Why?" "The trust was structured in 1967 by an attorney named Whitcomb. He is long dead. The firm has existed in 3 different forms since, but the trust has been administered continuously. Your grandmother set it up 2 years after she left Montana. She set it up specifically because she did not want the land to pass through her own estate. She did not want it to pass through your mother's either. She skipped 2 generations. She did." "Why?" "She told Whitcomb at the time that the cost of the secret should not fall on the daughter who had been in the room when it happened. She wanted the land to reach somebody who was far enough away from October of 1965 that it could be a beginning. instead of an ending. I sat with that. For a long moment. Mr. Pemberton, Owen Burroughs, is he still up there on the ridge? Lawrence Pemberton's hands did not move. His face did not change, but his eyes settled on me in a particular way. The way a man's eyes settle when he has been waiting for a very long time for somebody to walk into his office and ask him a specific question. Yes, he is still up there. What do I do? Miss Ashworth, that is the one question in this entire matter that is not mine to answer. It is yours. You are the only living person who knows. Whatever you do, or whatever you do not do, I will help you with it. I will also not push you. I drove back up the mountain that evening with the deed and the notebook sitting on the passenger seat where my son usually sat. Jonas had stayed at the cabin with Webb Crowley's wife, Etta, who had walked up the gravel road 2 mornings before with a casserole dish balanced on her hip and said, "You must be Marigold." Thad spoke of you once, as if that sentence had been waiting in her mouth for a decade. I made the turn off the highway, onto the gravel road, as the last of the light went out behind the ridge. And as I drove, I did the math. 231 acres of Montana mountain land, timber on most of it. A logging company in Helena had already left 2 business cards under the porch mat at the lawyer's office, the way logging companies do when they smell new ownership of old land. I could not sell the cabin. The will was firm. But the land was mine to do with as I liked. I could sell off enough of the land to put Jonas through college twice, to buy a small ranch house in a small town with a grocery store and a school and a library. To never, for the rest of my natural life, sit in a sedan in a parking lot counting $23.17. I want you to know I thought about it. I owe you that honesty. I thought about it that whole drive up the mountain, after Jonas was asleep again in the rocking chair, after I had banked the fire in the wood stove, after I had sat down at the kitchen table with the deed in front of me and a pencil in my hand and the temptation laid out as plain and clean as any equation I had ever seen. $47 and a child in a sedan, or a life, a real one. I thought about it for 4 days. On the 5th day, I walked up to the ridge. I left Jonas at the cabin with a peanut butter sandwich and a book and a strict instruction not to open the door for anybody who wasn't me or Etta Crowley. He nodded solemnly. He understood instructions the way only children who have lived in shelters understand instructions. How long, Mama? Couple hours. Where are you going? To think. About what? I knelt down so I was his height. About whether we stay. He chewed his bottom lip. What do you want me to think about while you're gone? I looked at him for a long moment. Think about the dog, I said. The one we might get. His whole face changed. Really? Maybe. What kind? You decide. While I'm gone. He sat down at the kitchen table with the most serious expression I had ever seen on a 9-year-old's face, like the future of canine selection across all of western Montana was now resting on his shoulders. I closed the cabin door behind me. I walked. The trail up the ridge was a deer path more than anything else. Switchbacks. Loose granite under my boots. The pines thinned the higher I climbed. By the time I reached the top, the wind was coming hard across the rocks, and the sky was that pale Montana blue that has nothing soft in it. I sat down on a flat stone. I looked out. 3 valleys, stitched together by the thin silver thread of a river. I sat there a long time, and I thought about Rosalind Kessler at 24 years old, 3 weeks after October 9th, 1965, standing in a boarding house in some town somewhere south of here, holding a child, her hands still shaking from what she had seen. I thought about her not in 1965, but 2 years later, in 1967, sitting down with a lawyer named Whitcomb, putting her signature on a piece of paper. She would have been 26 years old. Her hands would still have been shaking. Maybe. And in that condition, in that grief, With Hetty 5 years old now, and starting to ask questions Rosalind could not answer. With money that she did not have and a life she had not figured out how to live yet in that condition, Rosalind Kessler had sat down and signed away 231 acres of mountain land. Not to herself, not to her daughter, to a granddaughter who had not been born, who would not be born for another 20 years, whose name she would not live to know. She had planted a tree. She had planted a tree she knew she would never sit under. She had planted it for me. I cried for the second time in a week, quietly, the way women cry when they are alone and there is no point in being loud about it. You don't sell a tree like that, not the first week you sit under it. I walked back down the mountain. I came into the cabin, and Jonas was at the kitchen table exactly where I had left him, except now he had drawn 7 pictures of 7 different dogs and arranged them in order from most desirable to least desirable across the wooden surface. He looked up. "Mama, did you decide?" I decided. "Are we staying?" "We're staying." He looked at me for one long second. Then he said, "Then I picked this one." He pushed the top picture across the table. It was a gray mutt with one ear that wouldn't stand up. The first winter was hard. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. The cabin had not been winterized in any meaningful sense in 60 years. The wood stove worked but ate firewood faster than I could split it. The pipes from the hand pump froze the first week of December, and I had to learn fast how to wrap them and how to let the faucet drip and how to thaw them with a hairdryer plugged into a propane generator that Webb Crowley brought up the gravel road one morning in the bed of his pickup truck without being asked. Webb was somewhere in his early 70s then. He had a face like a leather glove and the slowest smile I had ever seen on a man. He showed up the second morning after Jonas and I arrived, climbed the porch steps with his hat in one hand and said, "Marigold, is it? Thad spoke of you once?" I said yes. He said, "I'll be back tomorrow with my wife." He came back the next morning with Etta and a casserole dish and a child's coat that didn't fit their grandson anymore. Etta took one look at Jonas's sleeves and said, "Come here, honey. This is yours now." And that was that. Webb taught me to split wood that first November. He came up 3 times a week for 2 weeks until my hands stopped bleeding inside my gloves. He didn't talk much while he taught. He just showed me where to plant my feet, how to read the grain, when to step back so the maul did the work instead of my shoulders. On the 3rd week, I split a whole cord on my own. Webb watched from the porch. When I was done, he said, "That'll do." That was the most praise I got out of Webb Crowley in 6 years. I lived on it for the entire first winter. Etta taught me to can, to preserve, to turn the wild huckleberries that grew on the south slope into jam that would last us until April. She taught me which mushrooms in the woods were safe and which would kill you. She taught me to dry herbs from the kitchen garden that Rosalind Kessler had planted in 1962, and that had gone wild for 60 years and was still somehow producing rosemary and thyme and a particular kind of mountain sage that smelled like a memory I didn't have. A woman named Dolores, who worked at the post office in Cedar Junction, taught me without ever appearing to teach me anything that a small town will absorb a stranger at exactly the speed the stranger absorbs it. By February, people had stopped looking at me when I walked into the diner. By April, they had started saving me a seat. There was money in the tin box. I haven't told you that yet. I haven't told you because the money wasn't the point. But there was money. Coins, mostly. Old ones. A few stacks of bills that Thaddeus had been setting aside for I don't know how long. Enough to fix the roof when the spring rains came and showed me where it was leaking. Enough to replace the missing porch step. Enough to buy a used Ford pickup truck off a man in Cedar Junction who said he was selling it because his wife had finally won the argument about needing a car with a back seat. I did not fix the cabin up beyond what it needed. It had held its own shape for 60 years. It did not want to become something else. I respected that. The dog came in February, a gray mutt with one ear that wouldn't stand up. Webb Crowley's nephew up in Helena had a litter of strays his daughter had found behind a feed store, and Webb made one phone call and showed up at my door one afternoon with the pup tucked inside his jacket like a loaf of warm bread. Jonas named him Thaddeus. I had to sit with that one for a while, but Jonas was right, and the dog was right. And by the end of that first year, the name had settled into the cabin the way a cat settles into a sunbeam. The second spring is when Imani came. It was a Tuesday in April. The mountain had finally stopped freezing every night. Jonas was at the kitchen table doing math homework for the school in Cedar Junction that he was now enrolled in. I was outside hanging laundry on the line Webb had strung between two pines the previous October. I heard the car before I saw it. Old engine, not the sound of a local truck, the sound of a sedan that had come a long way and was running on fumes and prayers. I turned. A Buick, mid-90s, Oregon plates, white paint gone gray with road dust. It coasted to a stop at the bottom of the gravel pull-off. The engine cut. Nobody got out. I dried my hands on my jeans, and I started walking down. When I got close, I could see two faces through the windshield. A young woman in the driver's seat, maybe 26, maybe 28, dark hair. And I saw this before I saw anything else, a bruise, fresh, yellowing at the edges over her right eye. In the passenger seat, a little girl, maybe Jonas's age, holding a stuffed bear, missing one button eye. The woman saw me coming. She did not get out. She rolled the window down halfway. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I knew the look on her face. I had worn the look on her face. In a parking lot in Cheyenne, in a Walmart in Denver, in every parking lot of every shelter I had ever pulled into, it was the look of a woman who had nowhere left to drive. I leaned my forearm on the roof of the car. How long you been on the road? 4 days. Where from? Bent? Where are you headed? She looked at me. She didn't answer. Yeah, I figured. I looked at the little girl. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's mouth and the very still face of a child who has learned that being quiet is a way of staying safe. I straightened up. I looked at the cabin behind me, at the porch, at the lintel. Hold fast. I looked back at the woman. I don't have a lot, but I have a room and I have time. Come on up to the house. She stared at me. You don't know me. No, you don't know anything about me. No, I could be lying. You're not. She started crying then. The kind of crying you do when somebody you have never met says something to you that you have been waiting 11 months to hear. I had done that crying. In a small bedroom in the back of a church basement in Salina, Kansas, when a woman named Marlene had handed my son a juice box and not asked me a single question, I opened the passenger door for the little girl. Honey, what's your name? She whispered it. Zora. Zora. There's a boy up at the house who's exactly your age. His name is Jonas. He has a dog named Thaddeus. The dog's ear doesn't stand upright. You want to come meet him. Zora looked at her mother. Her mother nodded. Just once. Just enough. Zora climbed out of the car holding her bear. I held out my hand. She took it. We walked up the gravel road toward the cabin together. Her mother followed. She stayed 7 weeks. Her name was Imani Hollifield. She was 27 years old. She had been with the same man since she was 19. He worked for a paving company in Central Oregon, and he came home different every night, and on the night that had finally made her run, he had broken her cheekbone against the door of the refrigerator while their daughter watched from the hallway. She told me all of this in pieces over the 7 weeks she stayed. always at night, always after Zora was asleep, always with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, like the mug was the only thing keeping her upright. I did not push for any of it. She offered it the way women offer the truth to other women, in fragments. When the fragments stopped hurting enough to come out, I gave Imani the room at the end of the hall, the master bedroom, the one with the braided rug and the iron bed frame and the floorboards under which I had found a tin box on my second morning in this cabin. I gave Zora the small bedroom on the left, the one with the iron child's bed and the quilt with the forget-me-nots and the 3 worn-out books on the low shelf. I told Zora the books were hers to read while she was here. I told her that another little girl had slept in that bed once, a long time ago, and that the bed was glad to have somebody small in it again. Zora slept in that bed for 7 weeks. She and Jonas became inseparable. She taught him how to braid a rope. He taught her how to call for the dog. On the morning Imani left driving away in a different car, a more reliable one that Webb's nephew had helped her find in Helena, headed for an address in northern Idaho, she stood on the porch of the cabin and held me by both shoulders. I don't know how to thank you. You don't? Marigold. How did you know? Know what? That I wouldn't hurt you, that it was safe to bring me up here. I thought about how to say it, because I was you, 11 months, in a sedan, with a 9-year-old, counting $47. She looked at me, and somebody made room, my grandmother, 60 years ago. Before she knew I existed, Imani started crying again. I held her. I held her for a long time. When she pulled back, she wiped her face and said, "This place, what is it?" I looked up at the lintel. "It's a promise," I said. "From who?" "From a woman who didn't get to keep hers." After Imani, there was a woman named June. After June, a woman named Marta, who brought her 2 young sons with her. After Marta, a woman named Solveig, whose name I had to ask her to spell 3 times before I got it right. After Solveig, a woman who would only give me her first initial R, and who stayed 2 nights and disappeared one morning before sunrise with a thank you note pinned to the pillow with one of my hair clips. I never advertised. I never made a sign. Word traveled the way. Word travels in places that still have porches. Some women stayed a weekend. Some stayed a season. One woman, a quiet 70-year-old named Imogene, who had finally left her husband of 46 years, stayed almost 5 months and slept every single night in the same iron bed where Hetty Burroughs had slept. As a child, Imogene died in that bed, in her sleep, the spring of my 4th year at the cabin. She died peacefully. She died free. She had asked me 2 weeks before if she could be buried up on the ridge, near the spot where the wind comes hard across the rocks, and you can see 3 valleys at once. We did it. Webb dug the grave. Etta read a poem. I marked the spot with a flat stone. I did not carve anything on the stone. Imogene had told me, the week before she died, that she had spent 46 years wearing somebody else's name, and she did not want to wear it for 1 more minute, even in the ground. I respected that. The upstairs bedroom, Rosalind's bedroom, the one with the photograph of 3 people on a porch, became the room that women slept in. I kept the photograph on the bedside table. I did not move it. I wanted every woman who slept in that room to look at it before she went to sleep, even if she didn't know what she was looking at. A woman with a baby on her hip, a man 2 steps behind her, not touching, a second of held breath before whatever was about to happen. I wanted them to know that she had stood right there on that porch in 1963, and that she had gotten out, even if it cost her everything. I want to tell you what I did about Owen Burroughs, because you have been waiting to know. I thought about it for 3 years. I went up to the bend in the creek every season. I sat under the cedar tree where I knew he was buried, and I tried to feel what I was supposed to feel. I never felt rage. I had expected to feel rage. I never felt forgiveness either. I had thought maybe eventually I might. I never did. What I felt sitting under that cedar tree was a kind of quiet, the quiet that comes when you understand that what happened was not yours to undo. I read Thaddeus's notebook 6 or 7 times. I talked to Lawrence Pemberton twice more. I asked him the second time what he thought I should do. He told me the same thing he had told me the first. This is not mine to answer, Marigold. This is yours. The moment I knew came on a Sunday in November, 5 years into my time at the cabin. The wind was up. I was sitting on the porch in a wool coat that Etta Crowley had given me. Webb had passed several years earlier, and Etta had been giving away his clothes piece by piece to people she thought he would have liked. Jonas was inside, doing his 8th grade homework. The dog Thaddeus was at my feet, and I had Rosalind's wedding ring in my pocket. I had taken to carrying it. I don't know why. I think it had become a kind of grounding stone, a small heavy thing in my pocket that reminded me every time my hand brushed it that I came from somewhere, that I belonged to somebody. I sat there on the porch, and I asked her, out loud, Rosalind, what do you want me to do? I am not a woman who hears voices. I am not a woman who believes in signs. I am a woman who has spent her whole life on the practical end of the world. But sitting on that porch in the wind with the cedar tree on the far side of the ridge that I could not see from where I was sitting, but that I knew was there, I had the clearest thought I had ever had in my life. It was not a voice, it was a thought. The thought was, I already paid for him, don't pay for him again. I sat with that thought until the sun went down behind the ridge. Then I went inside, and I made dinner for my son, and I made my decision. I did not call the sheriff. Not because I was a coward, not because I was protecting myself, not because I was afraid of what an excavation would cost me. I did not call because Rosalind had told me not to. She had told me, sitting on a porch in 1,963 inches of photograph, by the way she held her child away from him. She had told me in a boarding house in 1965, by the way she had grabbed her brother's wrist and said no. She had told me in 1967, by the way she had signed away the land to a granddaughter she would never know. She had told me every way a dead woman can tell a living woman anything, that she did not want him dug up. She had paid for him. She had paid for him in silence. She had paid for him with her brother and her daughter and her own life. And to call the sheriff now would be to make her pay one more time. I would not make her pay one more time. I went up to the cedar tree. It was the 5th anniversary of the day Jonas and I had crossed the threshold of this cabin. I carried a flat stone with me, about the size of my palm. I had found it in the lower field, and I had been saving it for this. I knelt at the base of the cedar. I set the stone down. I did not carve anything into it. I did not say a name. I said, out loud, with only the creek to hear me, this is as much as I can give you. It is more than you gave them. I hope it is enough. I walked home. Jonas is 15 now. He's taller than me by 3 inches. He has my mother's eyes, the eyes I did not recognize in him until I saw the photograph in the cabin and understood whose face had been hiding inside his. He works in the woods on Saturdays with Webb Crowley's grandson, who now runs his late grandfather's small logging operation. Jonas reads at night. He plays the guitar badly but cheerfully that I bought him for his 12th birthday at a pawn shop in Helena. He still chews his bottom lip when he's thinking it is the only thing his father left him. And I am still grateful for it, because a boy who thinks before he speaks is a boy who will always find his way home. Last summer, sitting on the porch after supper, the dog Thaddeus asleep at his feet. Jonas said, "Mama, do you ever wonder what would have happened if that lawyer hadn't called?" I thought about it. Sometimes. Not as often as I used to. Where do you think we would be? I don't know, baby. Somewhere. He was quiet for a long minute. The sun was doing the slow, long thing it does in the mountains. The thing I still have not gotten used to. Mama, you know what I think about sometimes? What? I think about how we almost didn't come up that road. We almost didn't, but we did. We did. He looked out at the clearing. I'm glad we did. I reached across the porch swing and put my hand on the back of his neck. He still let me do that. 15 years old. He still let his mother put her hand on his neck. Me too, baby. The sun finished setting. The cabin at our backs was warm and full of supper smell and dog hair and the slightly off-tune hum of a refrigerator I had bought at an auction in my 3rd year here. Inside, on the wall above the fireplace, in a frame I had made myself out of pine that Webb had given me before he died, hung a photograph, the one of 3 people on the porch of this cabin in 1963. I had cropped it. I had cropped Owen Burroughs out of the frame, not to erase him. I don't believe in erasing, but because the photograph, the one I wanted hanging over my fireplace, was not about him. It had never been about him. It was about her, about Rosalind Kessler at 22 years old, with her baby on her hip, with her face held still, with the breath she was holding 3 seconds before whatever was about to happen happened, with her arms around the child she was going to carry out of this valley and into a silence that would have to last 60 years before a door on the other end of it could open. She had carried. Thaddeus had waited. Hetty had survived. And I, the one who had always stayed, the one who had counted $47, on a morning when I had given up, I had finally been given a place worth staying in. A place to stop running. A place to hold fast to. The cabin is still here. The door still says, "Hold fast," above the lintel. I understand what it means now. It was not an instruction, and it was not a prayer. It was a promise my grandmother left for a granddaughter she would never meet. I intend to keep it. I intend to keep it for as long as my hands are strong enough to keep anything. And when my hands aren't strong enough anymore, when my son Jonas is old enough and quiet enough and good enough to take it, I will hand him the key. The same iron key, the one that was heavier than it should have been, the one Lawrence Pemberton dropped into my palm on a November afternoon in a town the size of 3 blocks. And I will tell him, "Baby, hold fast." And he will know what I mean, because he has lived under those words for most of his life now. And because his great-great-grandmother carved them above this door before either of us was born, that is the inheritance. Not the cabin, not the land, the holding, the fast, the promise kept across 60 years of silence by women who could not afford to make a single sound. And that is enough.